You're listening to DNA ID, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, Scene of the Crime, Zodiac Speaking, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, Citizen Detective, and Campus Killings. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
It was 1971. Paul Robinson and Carrie D. came home late from a night out at the Harbor Hideaway Bar and Restaurant in Burlington, Vermont. The two shared a room in an apartment at 17 Brooks Avenue with Beverly Lanfer, who was also at the Hideaway. A fourth roommate who shared a bedroom with Beverly was 24-year-old Rita Curran. Paul and Carrie washed up and went to bed in the room they shared sometime around 1 a.m. on Tuesday, July 20th. Beverly came home and was ready for bed too, as it was 1:20 a.m., and she tried to be quiet as she tiptoed toward the bedroom she shared with Rita. Beverly did not turn on a light as she expected Rita was asleep in bed. Rita was not asleep in bed. Beverly went to her closet, and that's when she saw Rita. Rita was lying naked and spread-eagled on the floor, her tossed reddish hair still with some curlers clinging to it, her face bloodied and battered. Beverly ran into Carrie and Paul's room screaming, "Something is wrong with Rita." Using the apartment phone, Beverly dialed 0 for operator and requested the medical center emergency room. Upon hearing Beverly say there was a person who might be dead at her apartment, the hospital connected Beverly with the Burlington Fire Department ambulance crew. Crew members David Bean and Stephen Olio arrived at the Brooks Avenue apartment house and were led to the woman on the bedroom floor, whom the roommates said was Rita Curran. The EMTs verified that Rita was dead. She had no pulse, she wasn't breathing, she was cool to the touch, and she was starting to stiffen. The ambulance crew notified the Burlington Police Department that they were needed. Officer Richard Garrow responded at 1:29 a.m., observed the woman on the floor, secured the scene, and called in the detective squad. While they were waiting, Officer Garrow spoke with Rita's shell-shocked roommates, whom he asked to sit on the couch and stay there, waiting to be interviewed. The entire Burlington Police Department homicide squad was called in. Detective Dennis Godin arrived at 2:10, along with Detective Sergeant Wayne Liberty and Detective Lieutenant Richard Bolio. They went into Rita and Beverly's bedroom and detailed their observations, which they documented in their notes. Dr. Levine, the regional medical examiner, and Dr. Lawrence Harris of the medical examiner's office, and then Chittenden County State's Attorney Patrick Leahy, now former U.S. Senator of Vermont, arrived and were briefed. Leahy called in Trooper Leo Blaise of the Vermont State Police to report to the scene, and he did so at 2:20 a.m. Dr. Harris made notes of his observations of the body, and he and Dr. Levine turned Rita over to inspect her backside after the detectives had taken pictures and made their own observations. Detective Lieutenant Bolio and Detective Sergeant Liberty documented the following about the body and the crime scene as they collected physical evidence. Rita lay 3 or 4 feet inside the bedroom door on her back with arms outstretched. Her buttocks were propped up on what appeared to be bedding from the bed, and her legs were spread wide apart. Her head tilted slightly to the side. Her face bore signs of a severe beating as it was swollen, scratched, and discolored, and her eyes were blackened, and her face was completely covered in dried blood like a ghoulish mask. Her mouth and teeth were also bloody. Her hair, with some curlers still clinging to her long red tresses, was flung all about her face, and the detective's notes say, quote, with long strands being visible in the immediate vicinity on the floor area as if the hair had been pulled out by the intruder in the scuffle, end quote. Rita had some hairs in her left hand which were collected, and one long hair was collected from her right hand. They also collected various small hairs on Rita's head, arms, and upper body. As for her clothing, it appeared that Rita had been dressed in a nightgown and a housecoat when she was attacked. Apparently, it was typical for her to sleep in this outer garment, perhaps out of modesty because under it she was wearing an aqua-colored nightgown made of silk with lace or fringe around the top. A large segment of this nightgown had been ripped completely from the front of her body and was laying underneath her shoulders and back, so from a bird's eye view she appeared to be nude. The lower section of the nightgown was found in the doorway to the closet and was tagged into evidence by Sergeant Liberty. Rita's red and white polka dot housecoat, quote, apparently had been buttoned, but during the scuffle ripped down the front and several buttons were missing from same and were on the floor area of the bedroom, end quote. A pair of pink silk underpants was found in a tiny heap, partially under Rita's left leg. Both leg holes of the delicate underwear were ripped through. Police suspected that Rita had been startled awake when she was in bed. Her blood-stained white bedsheet was entangled under her left leg and lay partially under her buttocks. A floral bedspread had also been ripped from the bed and was entangled about Rita's left leg, also gathered under the buttocks. It, too, had blood on it. Finally, a beige afghan was also entangled around Rita's left leg and was partly underneath her buttocks. It was evident that these 3 items had been put there by Rita's assailant to raise her hips up off the ground. Rita's purse lay on the floor behind the door. It was unclear whether it had landed on the floor in the struggle, but it didn't appear to have been rifled or robbed. It still contained cash and Rita's ID. The detectives took note of and collected a sample of dirt from the bedroom floor, and that was when Detective Sergeant Liberty found the cigarette butt. It lay on the floor right near Rita's right elbow, between her right arm and her body. A curl of ash on the floor where the butt was informed the investigators that the cigarette had burned itself out rather than being extinguished. The butt wasn't crushed and appeared to have been dropped there. Back in 1971, everyone and their brother smoked. The butt could have been dropped by one of the first responders, but its existence also raised the possibility that Rita's killer had stood over her and smoked as he looked down at what he'd done. In a gesture of contempt, he dropped the smoldering butt nearly on his victim, or perhaps actually on his victim, and it rolled or bounced off onto the floor. This is from the report, quote, in checking the cigarette butt in question, we found it to be the name brand of Lark charcoal filter tip, and this was gathered as evidence, end quote. Detective Liberty's report noted that the butt and other evidence was all placed in plastic bags and labeled. At the time, the use of plastic bags was standard operating procedure. Not until years later did anyone learn about DNA and that evidence is best preserved in paper bags. The detectives then used a blue marking pencil to draw the outline of the body as it lay on the floor. You don't see this much anymore, but back in the day, again, it was standard operating procedure. The body was then removed by George Reddy Funeral Home personnel at 4:45 a.m. and delivered to the morgue. After Rita's body was removed at 6:45 a.m., the Burlington Police Department's CSI, Officer Harold Baker, arrived to begin gathering evidence from the apartment as we've discussed. Meanwhile, detectives photographed the inside of the apartment as well as the exterior of the building. They measured the dimensions of the bedroom. A section of linoleum flooring under Rita's body was then cut out and gathered as evidence and blood sampling. So was another section, which had a latent fingerprint friction ridge detail on it. A partial palm print was lifted from the door to Rita's bedroom. Rita's car was parked in the driveway beside the house, and there was no sign that anyone had messed with it. It was a very puzzling crime scene that looked very much like an inside job. The autopsy on Rita was conducted at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner at the Medical Alumni Building in Burlington, Vermont, by state pathologist and Chief M.E. Lawrence S. Harris, M.D., on July 20th at 5 a.m. Dr. Harris observed and documented multiple recent blunt impacts to Rita's face and head, likely with a fist. These blows resulted in facial contusions, abrasions, and lacerations. Dr. Harris also cited hemorrhages of the right and left temporalis muscles, hemorrhage of the scalp, and bilateral acute pulmonary hemorrhages. As for the cause of death, it was asphyxia by manual strangulation. Rita had a fractured hyoid bone, hemorrhages of the neck muscles, abrasions and contusions on her throat, and multiple petechial hemorrhages of the face and neck, with conjunctival hemorrhages of the eyes. The manner of death, of course, was homicide. Finally, Rita also had bruises on her right leg just above the knee, and on the inside of both legs where, perhaps, her legs were forced apart. She also had fresh lacerations of the vagina and contusion of her vaginal wall. Someone had very forcibly penetrated her with a foreign object, causing tearing and hemorrhage. Semen was found inside Rita when the pathologist collected samples from her vagina. Dr. Harris collected pubic hair combings and fingernail scrapings as part of his examination. These were sealed and marked for the investigators. Rita's autopsy showed she weighed in at just 104 pounds. She was diminutive and likely had been quickly overpowered by her assailant, especially as it appeared she was almost certainly in bed when beset by her attacker. Chittenden County State's Attorney Patrick Leahy said, quote, "It was the most brutal murder I've seen since taking office," end quote. Others commented that it was the only violent murder in recent memory. This stuff just did not happen in Burlington. So who was Rita? Rita Patricia Curran was born on June 21, 1947 in Brooklyn, New York, to parents Thomas and Mary Curran. She had a brother, Thomas, and a sister, Mary. Her father was Canadian and was in the British Royal Navy before moving to Brooklyn. The family moved to Milton, Vermont in 1957, and Thomas worked for IBM for 21 years. Rita was an honors student at the all-girls Catholic Mount St. Mary Academy High School. After that, she attended Trinity College in Burlington, an all-women's Catholic college that is now closed. While at Trinity, Rita lived at home and was in the college choral group. Music was a big part of her life. She performed as a singer throughout her elementary, middle, and high school years and won various awards and honors for her vocal work. In 1970, Rita became second-grade teacher at Milton Elementary, where the kids seemed to really like her. She did outside work with underprivileged children as well. She also sang in the Champlain Echoes Barbershop Quartet and taught religious education at her church, St. Anne's. Rita was very close with her parents, and she and her mom were both members of the Milton Women's Club. Her parents celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary in April, shortly before her death. The summer she died, 24-year-old Rita was working as a chambermaid at the Colonial Motor Inn in Burlington. She had worked there for the past 3 summers in a row to supplement her 9-month teacher income. Rita was good friends with the other staff members there and told them she considered herself an ugly duckling, but she aspired to marry and have a family. She was also enrolled in a summer reading and language arts workshop at UVM's graduate program. Before that summer of 1971, Rita had never not lived at home, but at age 24, she wanted to be closer to UVM and her job. So she answered an ad for a roommate that was listed in the Burlington Free Press, and Beverly responded. Rita had moved into the apartment on June 20th, just 1 month earlier, and she did not know Carrie, Paul, or Beverly before they became roommates. The three admitted after her murder that they hadn't really hit it off. Rita was shy and hadn't really gelled with the young people she cohabitated with. She was quiet, kept to herself, had her own group of other local friends, spent a lot of time at her parents' house, and didn't really spend much time at the apartment at all. Carrie, Paul, and Beverly didn't know much about Rita other than what she did for a living, but they were able to tell police that she did not have a lot of people back to the apartment and she did not have a boyfriend. Even though she was 24, Rita was somewhat sheltered, and she wasn't accustomed to living with multiple other young people who might be more boisterous and outgoing than she. After her death, her parents reported that Rita was recently quite upset because one morning she found a strange man sleeping on the couch in the living room, a guy one of her roommates had let sleep over. This did not work for Rita, who felt that a stranger being on her apartment sofa all night was a violation of her privacy. She had just moved into the Brooks Avenue apartment, but now she planned to move out on Wednesday of the week in which she was killed. She never had that chance. Rita's funeral at St. Anne's Church was attended by more than 400 people. Presiding over the solemn ceremony was the Reverend N. Joseph Prey. I'm not kidding. Sounds like his vocation was predestined. Several plainclothes detectives attended the funeral, eagle eyes on the crowd for anyone who stood out. Let's talk about the setting here. Burlington, Vermont, home to the University of Vermont, is the quintessential college town. The quirky, casual, laid-back atmosphere appeals to outdoorsy young people seeking an offbeat college experience. Church Street, the heart of downtown Burlington, is lined with shops and restaurants, and students, skiers, and seasonal leaf peepers throng the streets. It's the hometown of environmentally aware Ben & Jerry's ice cream, to give you an idea. The apartment house where Rita, Carrie, Paul, and Beverly lived was just 3 blocks from the UVM campus, on a quiet, residential street in a safe neighborhood. It was a large, shingled 3-story house with a covered front porch and ornate trim. Rita, Paul, Carrie, and Beverly's apartment was on the first floor on the east side of the house, with the front door facing north onto Brooks Avenue. The apartment itself was a 2-bedroom, one shared by Paul and Carrie and the other shared by Rita and Beverly. The apartment front door opened into the living room. Carrie and Paul's bedroom was off the living room. Rita and Beverly's bedroom was toward the rear of the apartment, off a small hallway that led to the kitchen and bathroom. As for the bedroom Rita and Beverly shared, it was right across the hall from the kitchen. In the room were 2 beds, 2 closets, a desk, and a dresser the 2 young women shared. When detectives arrived, the room wasn't in massive disarray, but there were definite signs that a struggle had occurred. In his report, Lieutenant Beaulieu said Rita put up a vicious struggle. Rita had gone to bed with curlers in her hair and a hairnet over them. The curlers and the net were found largely scattered about, with amounts of hair in the curlers that indicated that some of them had been forcibly pulled out of her head. As I mentioned earlier, buttons from Rita's housecoat were on the floor, too. It had clearly been forcibly ripped open, buttons flying on either side of the bed. A ripped portion of the front of her nightgown was flung across the bed and across the room, and was found near the closet. A pillow on the floor near the closet had drops of blood on it. A radio lay on its side in the southeast corner of the room. And this directly from the police report by Lieutenant Beaulieu. Quote, "On further checking the bedroom, we found that the lace curtain in the window on the west side and toward the south corner had been completely torn from the curtain rod, and this was laying on the floor on top of the stereo set. From all indications, the major part of the struggle took part on the right-hand side of the bed and in this confined area, as the bed had been pushed a foot or more toward the east wall." End quote. Rita and her attacker had struggled next to the bed in the corner of the bedroom. Police believed her attacker beat her about the face as he tried to get her onto the bed. Tellingly, blood was on the bedroom door jamb. Police concluded that Rita had tried to escape that way, and the suspect overpowered her and threw her onto the floor. The blood-stained door jamb was collected in its entirety. The kitchen across the small hallway from Rita's bedroom had an exterior door that opened to a small shed or storage area, which was found unlocked. The storage area in turn opened to a 5-by-5-foot porch and the rear yard of the house. A storm door connecting the shed and the porch was closed, but not locked. The door itself was open. Sergeant Liberty inspected the rear door that led from the apartment to the porch area and noted blood on the outside, both in the center and in one of the lower panels. Liberty's report says, quote, "Further checking the shed, I noted that on the door leading from the shed to the kitchen, on the shed side of the door, there were 2 spots of blood." End quote. These were near the doorknob. Based on these drops, Liberty concluded the suspect had left the scene via this door, smearing the blood from his person on his way out. The question was whether he had come in the same way. It seems unlikely he would know about the kitchen exit door if he hadn't. The little storage shed area between the porch and the rear door of the apartment was about 4.5 feet wide by 7 feet long. A gray waste paper basket was tipped over, dented, and had apparently been stepped on. Trash had spilled out onto the floor next to it. This from the report documenting what the roommate Paul Robinson reported. Quote, "Robinson, upon looking out into the shed, stated that the basket in question, which was tipped over and bent, had been placed on the porch outside by he, Robinson, the night before the crime, and this was located up against the storm door, holding it in an open position. Robinson stated that he had no chance to empty same and thus had placed it on the porch." End quote. The report continues, quote, "Sergeant Liberty and this writer, Lieutenant Beaulieu, then checked the east side of the house and the windows, but could not find where any possible entrance could be made. Upon going onto the front porch, we checked the windows in this location and found a bedroom window next to the front entrance unlocked, but to open this window we found to be very difficult." End quote. A basement window and door were both dusty and cobwebby. No one had gotten in that way. The detectives next inspected the house's driveway, the sandy part of which reflected no footprints. The grass in the backyard was long and wet from rain and didn't appear that anyone had walked through it. But all the interest in the windows, basement, and locks faded quickly when the investigators noted that the inside chain on the front door of the apartment was broken. But then they spoke with Paul. He told them the chain had been that way for months. And what's more, he told them the killer could have walked freely into the apartment. Quote, "Robinson continued to relate that the doors in this apartment are never kept locked. This includes the front entrance and the rear door, and it has been the policy of the occupants never to lock the doors." Well, well, well. Police had pretty quickly dismissed the idea that Rita had had a male visitor who had killed her. Based on what they learned about Rita, that she didn't have a boyfriend and that she was sheltered and easily scandalized by men sleeping over, she had not let a man into her apartment while she was in her nightie and curlers. But who would have known that the door to the apartment was never locked? And what's more, the police learned from the roommates that this night was the very first night on which Rita had ever been home alone in the apartment in the nighttime hours. That could not be a coincidence. The detectives did end up concluding that Rita's killer had come in through the back door, from the trash can having been moved and Paul reporting that the trash can had been propping the storm door open. They came to believe that the killer came in through the rear porch, moved the trash bin into the shed, allowing the storm door to close, and walked through the rear entrance to the kitchen and across the hall into the bedroom where Rita lay asleep. At the scene, the detectives and Dr. Levine took statements from Carrie, Beverly, and Paul, who was a 23-year-old college grad working as a mechanic. Here's what they learned about the timeline of events. Rita worked a maid shift at the Colonial Motor Inn that day from 8:15 to 2:40. Paul picked up his girlfriend Carrie at work around 7:30. They went to the apartment and changed clothes and cleaned up, and then around 8:50 p.m. they left to go to dinner at the Harbor Hideaway Bar on Shelburne Road. Rita had gone to her barbershop quartet rehearsal on North Avenue, and when she came home at 10, Paul and Carrie were out, but Beverly was home. At 11:15, Paul and Carrie called the apartment and pleaded with Beverly to come meet them. Rita was asleep in bed alone, but Beverly decided to go join them. She left the apartment at 11:20 p.m. and drove to the Harbor Hideaway Bar. Beverly, Carrie, and Paul hung out at the bar for a bit, and then Paul and Carrie went home around 12:30. Beverly stayed at the bar for a little longer. After Carrie and Paul got home, they sat in the living room for a spell, and they could see that the door to Rita's room was open about 12 inches. But it was dark and quiet in there, so they assumed she was asleep, as Beverly had said she was asleep when she came to meet them. They went to bed. Beverly came home and went to bed, and that's when she found Rita on the floor just inside the bedroom door. When she ran and got Paul, Paul came into her room and saw Rita lying on the floor, nude, not breathing, with blood covering her face. He tried to give her mouth-to-mouth and CPR, but he knew she was dead because she was cold. He yelled at Beverly to call the hospital or emergency number. He couldn't remember what he said exactly. And then a short time later, the fire department ambulance crew arrived. So are you getting this timeline? Rita was asleep in bed at 11:20 p.m. when Beverly left the apartment. Rita was dead on the floor when Beverly entered the room at 1:20 a.m. Paul and Carrie had gotten home at 12:30 and heard and saw nothing, leading investigators to believe that Rita was already dead. This meant that she'd been beaten, raped, and killed in the 70-minute window of time between those two bookend events. As Lieutenant Beaulieu's report said, quote, "It's hard to visualize an intruder lucky enough to come upon this particular house, which was unlocked and no one else was home, during this short span of time." End quote. There was more. Sergeant Liberty asked Paul about the Lark brand cigarette butt they had found next to Rita's body. They believed that the butt had been dropped by Rita's killer, given its location and the fact that the ash found there had not been disturbed by any movement. It got there after she was dead. Paul reported that neither Rita nor Beverly smoked. He and Carrie did, but they smoked Benson and Hedges or Winston's. Lark was a relatively unknown brand, and no one, Paul knew, smoked those. So given all this, especially the timeline, police formed the theory that Rita's attack could not have been a random home invasion by a stranger. No way could someone have gotten so lucky as to enter the apartment in the 70-minute, unpredictable time period in which no one else was home. And they believed that Rita was attacked when she was asleep in bed. Had someone targeted her? Was someone watching the apartment? How did he know her roommates would not come home midst-attack? Or did they come home midst-attack? It was distinctly possible that the suspect had been in Rita's room when Paul and Carrie came home. From Rita's bedroom, especially with the missing curtains, which had been torn down, he could have seen Paul's headlights as he parked his car on the west side of the house. He could have dashed from the bedroom through the kitchen to the back door. Paul and Carrie would not be able to see his exodus from their vantage point in the living room. He left Rita's blood on the bedroom door as he ran, and also smeared blood on the outside of the kitchen door as he rushed to escape the premises. Then in the dark, he tripped on the trash bin that he had moved inside the shed and knocked it over. Righting himself, he opened the storm door leading to the yard and ran into the night. Officer Guerra was instructed to begin canvassing the neighbors at 7 a.m. He went door to door in the apartment building, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything. Now, it's important to note that the apartment house Rita and her friends lived in was at 17 Brooks Street. But the large house actually contained two separate addresses. 17 Brooks Avenue was the same building as 15 Brooks Avenue, and the two addresses encompassed 3 separate units, even though they were all under one large rambling roof. 17 was the ground floor unit, and 15 was the units on floors 2 and 3. The addresses had separate entrances. At 15 Brooks Avenue, the second-floor apartment was occupied by Sally Kay, Jenny K., Leslie C., and Diane S. These women told the canvassing officer that they hadn't seen or heard anything at all suspicious the night before. The third floor was occupied by husband and wife William and Michelle DeRoos. Officer Garrow's report said, quote, "On the third floor, I talked to William DeRoss," he spells it wrong, age 31, and Michelle DeRoss, age 24. They both stated that they had heard nothing, and Mrs. DeRoss stated that she had been up around 1 a.m. but had heard no unusual noises or anything else, end quote. Detective Armand Winterbottom repeated the canvass of the building's residents later in the day. His report says the resident of the third-floor apartment, Mrs. DeRoos, stated that she did not hear or see a thing. She told Detective Winterbottom that she did not know anything was going on until she saw the police cars and the ambulance. Vermont State Police Corporal Bruce LaHue assisted the Burlington Police Department with the canvass. His report stated the following: "I talked with Michelle DeRoos, wife of William. Mrs. DeRoos stated that she heard and saw nothing, and as far as she knew, neither did her husband on the night of Monday, July 19th, 1971, end quote. The police also had to talk to all the neighbors in the large houses adjacent to Rita's. They were all very close together, separated by just a driveway's width. The police went door to door, conducting a knock and talk. Several of the neighbors said they'd been sitting out on their front porches until well after 10 p.m. the night before, but none of them had seen or heard anything. One neighbor, Philip H., said that he was watching TV around 12:15 a.m. after his nurse wife left for her night shift, and he heard a loud car start up outside on Brooks Avenue. He couldn't see much upon looking out the window other than a dark-colored sedan moving very fast heading east up the street. One Church Street neighbor said that her two poodles acted very strange around 11:15 p.m. They were barking at the front door area, but looking out the window, the witness saw nothing. No strange cars other than the one observed by Philip H. were observed in the area. It was as if the whole thing never happened, except for the dead young woman in the morgue. Rita's murder was big news in Burlington, the biggest. This from a recent article in the Daily Beast, quote, "This kind of horror was unheard of in Burlington, Vermont. It was a very innocent time," Paul Robinson, age 74, said. "I can't tell you how fast deadbolts flew off the shelves after Rita's murder," end quote. UVM students voiced shock at a fatal attack in that part of town, universally deemed safe. In the wake of Rita's murder, which, again, was completely uncharacteristic for Burlington, her female roommates, Beverly and Carrie, were terrified that they would be next. There was just no explanation for what had happened to Rita, and their apartment suddenly seemed incredibly ominous and unsafe to the women. They both moved out and sort of went into hiding, afraid the killer would seek them out. Meanwhile, police had no solid leads and issued a plea to the public for information. The result was over 100 calls, reporting everything from assaults to explicit crank calls to peeping toms. Some of these incidents had happened months earlier, and police had to investigate them all. Some of the investigators were assigned to run these tips down. Others met with Rita's parents, friends, and co-workers to generate a list of people to investigate. One of the people at the top of the list was an ex-boyfriend of Rita's from Milton. He was a teacher at South Burlington High School. He agreed to be questioned, and they brought him down to headquarters at 9:15 on the day of the murder. He was read his rights, and he signed a waiver and gave a written statement and a hair sample and fingerprints. He was asked what type of cigarette he smoked. Police believed him when he said he had not been in recent contact with Rita, and he had an ironclad alibi. They also questioned a young man whom Rita had been on a few dates with in the couple of weeks before her death, but ruled him out as well, again based on an alibi. On Wednesday, police did the pervert roundup, bringing in every male Burlington citizen who was a sex offender. They were all questioned about their alibis, quizzed about whether they smoked larks, and checked for any fresh cuts or scrapes. By the end of the day on Thursday, police had already questioned over 100 people. Lieutenant Beaulieu had canceled the summer vacations of his entire detective squad. It was all hands on deck to track down the man who had committed the most heinous murder in Burlington's recent history. Several items collected at the crime scene, including some of the foreign hairs found on Rita, had been sent to the FBI lab in Washington for forensic analysis, such as it was in 1971. A few days later, the CSI Harold Baker traveled to Washington to consult with FBI experts there. Meanwhile, at least 3 people who knew Rita were given lie detector tests. One of these was Paul Robinson. Chief of Detectives Lieutenant Beaulieu explained to the Burlington Free Press that the test was simply, quote, to clarify a few points in a past statement and the individual was not a suspect, end quote. Paul later told the Daily Beast, quote, that police pointed the finger at him at one point because he was the only male who was staying at the house. After an interrogation and polygraph test, however, he said police ultimately concluded he could not have been involved in the grisly crime. The three of us were told we weren't allowed to leave Burlington for the first month of the investigation, he added. It was nerve-wracking. Having someone think you're capable of murder stays with you, end quote. On Friday, State's Attorney Pat Leahy announced a media blackout. The rumors swirling and stories being passed around were causing community panic and derailing the investigation. And they didn't want the suspect to learn everything they knew. Leahy told the Burlington Free Press, quote, "We have developed some new and encouraging leads, but I can't say more than that. The rest of the case will be handled secretly," end quote. That same day, a meeting of all the investigators was held at Leahy's home, including the pathologist Dr. Harris, VSP Trooper Leo Blaise and Bruce Hugh, the state's attorney, ADA Fred Parker, and everyone working the case from the Burlington Police Department. That will just give you an idea of how significant this case was. That's a lot of brainpower in one room, all devoted to catching Rita's killer. The police investigation continued. Everyone Rita worked with, her friends from high school and college, acquaintances from her classes at UVM summer grad program, the manager and staff at the Colonial Inn, all were talked to. Police attended Rita's funeral and interviewed people there. They searched Rita's room for anything that might point to the name of her killer, but came up empty. At the time, the police believed that the less common Lark brand cigarette was their most significant clue. They were right, but not for the reasons they thought. Everyone they questioned was asked what brand of cigarette they smoked. Police wondered whether the attack on Rita was related to a rape that had happened on July 11th. Detective Dennis Godin confirmed to the Burlington Free Press that a 20-year-old woman had been asleep in her bed in a Pine Street apartment when she was awakened at 4 a.m. by a man standing over her. She screamed, but he threatened her and forced her to submit while he sexually assaulted her. After he was done, he left, having been there for only about 10 minutes. The survivor described him as only about 16 or 17 years old, about 5'8", wearing jeans and a green jacket. It was unknown how he'd gotten into the apartment, which was locked. Equally terrifying attacks on women in their homes seemed to spike around the time of Rita's murder and afterwards. In August 1971, a woman was asleep in her apartment at 53 Brooks Avenue, just down the block from Rita. She woke up at 2:30 a.m. when a white man, about 5'8" tall, was in her bedroom. He ran out when she screamed. That same night, a woman on South Willard was awakened by a man trying to get in through her Venetian blinds. Again, he fled when she screamed. Police also had responded to a complaint filed by a young woman on July 27th, who reported that a man had knocked on her door, purporting to be conducting a survey for a class at UVM. He then asked her whether she shaved her pubic hair, whether she masturbated, whether she would show him her breasts. This woman did not know the subject's name, as needless to say, she sent him packing immediately, but police took note of the gold-colored car he was driving, which had what sounded like Connecticut plates. Another lead was a peeping Tom who had scared numerous female residents in Rita's neighborhood. This nighttime prowler was seen by several people in their yards at their Brooks Avenue and Loomis Street homes, right near Rita's. One young woman, Carol Reeves, reported to the police that in August 1971, just 2 weeks after Rita's murder, a shirtless man tried to break into her apartment through a locked window after 11 p.m. She turned the light on and they made eye contact, and he fled. Carol called police and reported the incident, scared to death by the man's piercing eyes. Another group of women heard someone on their front porch, and then someone tried their front doorknob. A female resident opened the door with the chain on and saw a large man with a beard. He jumped into the bushes and fled. The women said they'd been receiving late-night prank calls from someone who just breathed into the phone as well. All of this stuff became much more serious after Rita was slain, and the women were scared. Police noted that a peeping Tom could easily have been watching Rita's apartment through her ground-floor living room window and seen that no one else was home. The lead about the prank calls became one of the more significant ones to police because they learned that Rita, too, had received some late-night calls from an anonymous caller breathing heavily. They came in several times a week around 10 p.m. She had reported these phone calls to her friends but had no idea who they were coming from. The calls didn't target her specifically, but came into the shared apartment phone. Paul told the Daily Beast, quote, "We were getting strange phone calls before Rita's murder. It was a random occurrence. It wasn't anything that happened every day or a particular time. But it was only in the evening from what I remember," Robinson said. "We were all concerned about the calls. It was really creepy," end quote. And police learned more about the phone calls that was disturbing. After the murder, a woman came forward and said she lived in the third floor apartment at 15 Brooks Avenue in the 1966 to 1968 timeframe, and she had been plagued by creepy phone calls from a man breathing heavily. What was scary about this was that the calls would start as soon as she entered her apartment from work, which was at varying times, and turn the lights on. They never happened when her boyfriend was there, but as soon as he left, literally was still on the stairs, the phone would ring. It even happened when she came home for lunch. She finally got so freaked out that she changed her number. The police report says, quote, she believes someone on the street was making the calls, end quote. Okay, let's talk about an early prime suspect. Remember I said that a neighbor of Rita's on Brooks Avenue had reported to the canvassers that he heard a loud car zooming away from the area on the night of the murder around 12:15 a.m. Well, police soon got a phone call from someone reporting Philip H.'s name. In 1970, Philip had been an orderly at a hospital in Burlington. One night in May, he asked a young nurse for a ride home. She agreed, but when Philip directed her to a location, it was an empty field. He grabbed her keys and threw them on the floor mat and then started beating her with his fists. Then he raped her on the ground outside the car. After he was done, he made her drop him off at Pearl and Willard, and he walked away. The survivor believed Philip was doing drugs at the time. As soon as the news of Rita's murder hit the headlines, this young nurse called the Burlington Police Department and reported the incident, which had never been reported when it happened. She felt that Philip H. was capable of the kind of violence that had befallen Rita. Detective Winterbottom interviewed her, and further investigation of Philip revealed that he had been transferred from the hospital and now worked part-time at the morgue. Hearing this, Lieutenant Bolio called up the M.E., Dr. Harris, and asked about Philip H. Harris said, "Oh yeah, he has a known drug problem, and I would not be surprised if he raped someone." He reported that Philip H. had come into the morgue asking about Rita's murder, overly interested in the case. Detectives learned that Philip H. was from Montpelier, so Vermont State Police Corporal Bruce LaHue and BPD Detective Dennis Godin went there to speak with the Montpelier PD. They were familiar with the 23-year-old Philip H., informing the investigators that he was a known alcoholic and drug addict. He didn't have much of a record as an adult, just a traffic stop, but he did have law enforcement contact as a juvenile. Godin and LaHue asked Philip to come on down to the BPD on August 20th for follow-up questioning about his report of seeing a car speeding away on the night of the murder. Of course, they suspected that it was possible he was trying to throw them off the track by making them believe Rita's killer had arrived and left in a car. Philip submitted to an interview with Lieutenant Bolio on that day and then traveled with the officers to Montpelier for a polygraph. Corporal LaHue's report says that they were unable to get Philip to break, i.e., confess, during the interrogation, but, quote, polygraph findings indicated that the subject was lying when asked pertinent questions relative to the murder of victim Rita Curran. He remains a prime suspect in this case, end quote. Philip H. willingly gave head hair, pubic hair, and palm print samples. He stayed firmly on the police list of suspects, even when the FBI lab reported that his hair samples did not match those at the crime scene. In the absence of public information about the case, rumors swirled all over town about who could have been involved. People's minds went to the conspiracy theories and cover-ups. Finally, the media blackout was lifted when, in September 1971, State's Attorney Leahy announced his intention to present the evidence in Rita's case to a grand jury. Police confirmed they had two good suspects. One of these was Philip H., and the other was another man whom I will address when I discuss the DNA elimination campaign. Anyway, if the grand jury ever happened, it's never been made public, and no charges were handed down. The police just didn't have enough to definitively pin the crime on anyone. By December 1971, one full-time detective was working the case, Wayne Liberty. And in early 1972, 8 months after the murder, police appeared to have no firm leads. A report by Lieutenant Richard Bolio, chief of detectives, reflects his frustration. It starts with, quote, "At this time, this writer is at a loss in explaining the brutal and senseless slaying of Rita Patricia Curran," end quote. Bolio and the other investigators were simply unable to figure out a motive in the case. Rita had been beaten to the point of unrecognizability, thrown onto the floor, and harshly stripped of her clothing. Yes, they believed that she'd been raped and the crime was sexually motivated, but Rita's vagina had been brutally torn and her attacker was clearly enraged when he beat her, penetrated her with a foreign object, and then manually strangled her on the floor. The vicious, violent, up-close and personal, brutal attack on the sweet, shy, diminutive young woman seemed excessive if the motive was simply rape. It made no sense to anyone. What police did know was that Rita's killer must have known that she was home alone that night, which meant that someone, perhaps the anonymous caller, perhaps someone else, was watching her." End quote. Detective Liberty told the Burlington Free Press, quote, "None of the 3 close friends in the apartment was a suspect, and several other friends of the teacher submitted to lie detector tests." End quote. Detective Liberty indicated that between 150 to 200 people had been interviewed to date. A $3,000 reward, considered substantial at that time, was offered by the Burlington Free Press and others, but there were no takers. On the 2nd anniversary of Rita's murder, the case was still described as open by the Chittenden State's Attorney's Office. Patrick Leahy said that the investigation had cost about $200,000 thus far, and that Chief of Detectives Lieutenant Beaulieu and Lieutenant Liberty continued to follow up on about 4 or 5 new leads a month. Leahy said, quote, "I would love to have a substantial lead. I cannot fault the police in this case. I am as frustrated as anyone else that they haven't been able to make an arrest, but I'm convinced that they have done everything possible. We keep track of anything that happens in New England of a similar nature." End quote. And they did. They kept a list of names of men who had committed violent crimes in the region and looked into them. While some of them were never ruled out, they weren't ruled in either. The case sputtered along for the next few years. A Burlington Free Press article in 1979 commemorating the 8th anniversary of Rita's murder quotes Detective Sergeant Timothy Rollins, saying the Rita Curran case file was still open, but police had had no leads for a long time. Quote, "We are not actively working on it," he admitted. Richard Beaulieu, who was chief of detectives in 1971, was still there, now a captain. He told the paper it was one of the biggest cases his department had ever handled. Quote, "No one has forgotten it, I'm sure. If we had a very good lead, we'd follow it up. It's the one case that's stumped us." He was right. Rita's case stood out as the one unsolved, brutal, inexplicable homicide in Burlington at this point. Even U.S. Senator Patrick Leahy, who had been at the scene as the Chittenden County State's Attorney in 1971, told the paper it was, quote, "a most frustrating thing. I don't know of anything the police put more time on," end quote. Rita's mother, Mary, told the Burlington Free Press, "I haven't forgotten it. I don't think it should be let lie. Nothing will ever bring her back, but we'd like to see justice done." Okay, let's talk about the most high-profile suspect in Rita's case. Rita's case received national attention after it emerged that police were considering this man possibly responsible for her murder. This was in 1989, 18 years after Rita was slain. I'm talking about the U.S.'s most famous serial killer, Ted Bundy. So how did Ted Bundy come to be a suspect in a Vermont murder when his known killings were generally on the West Coast and in Florida? Well, once Bundy was arrested, escaped in 1977, was arrested again, and became something of a phenomenon, members of law enforcement and others tangentially involved in the field started to study Bundy, his patterns, his known crimes, his suspected crimes, and other unsolved crimes that seemed similar to what he had done. And Rita's case drew the attention of retired FBI agent John Bassett. Bassett was from Burlington and was familiar with the confounding, inexplicable murder of Rita Curran. It was noted that Rita resembled some of Bundy's victims, wholesome white quote-unquote co-eds with dark hair parted down the middle. Of course, Bundy's stealth, cunning, and conniving could explain how someone pulled off Rita's murder in a 70-minute window of time, silently, and vanished without a trace. Bundy often strangled and bludgeoned his victims. Rita was strangled and bludgeoned. A lot of aspects of the case matched his M.O. But the suspicion of Bundy wasn't just because he was the kind of guy who was capable of doing it. Bundy had ties to Burlington. Bundy's birth name was Theodore Robert Cowell, born on November 24, 1946, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. He and Rita were born the same year, both infants coming into the world in the same small northern city, albeit under drastically different circumstances. And investigators noted with interest that the Lund Home for Unwed Mothers was literally right next door to the Colonial Motor Inn, where Rita was working as a chambermaid in 1971. Okay, so what? Rita worked at the Colonial Inn in 1971. Bundy was born next door in 1946. The connection was a quarter century off. Or was it? True crime writer Anne Rule rose to fame after the publication of her book, The Stranger Beside Me. If you haven't read it, you must. It details her friendship with Bundy well before anyone knew he was a serial killer, and then the discovery of his unthinkable secret life, the arrest, the victims, known and suspected, the trials, the end. Anne was Bundy's confidant in many ways. They corresponded even after he was arrested. After retired FBI agent Bassett called Anne and told her his idea about a possible link between Bundy and the Rita Curran case, she recalled that Ted Bundy had told her in the fall of 1971 that he'd been working on finding out who he really was, as he put it. He had learned of his birth at the Lund home in Burlington, and that the woman who raised him was not his sister but his mother. Anne Rule wondered, did Bundy's statement mean that he had traveled to Burlington to look at the records of the Lund home, see where he was born, examine his roots? And if so, had he checked into the Colonial Motor Inn next door? Had he glimpsed the pretty young chambermaid at the motel? It was not out of the realm of possibility, far from it. And there was another tantalizing tidbit. Anne found a report by an animal control officer, in those days called a dog catcher, about a person with the surname Bundy being bitten by a dog during the week Rita had died. Had Bundy been sneaking around Burlington yards at night and been chomped on by some homeowner's vigilant canine? Again, it was very, very possible. Burlington detectives took note. You might remember Carol Reeves, the young woman I talked about much earlier, who, in August 1971, had reported a man trying to break into her apartment via a locked window. When Carol saw the news about Ted Bundy in the papers in the late 1980s, highly publicized in the Burlington area because of his ties to the small city, Carol froze. She felt sure it was he who tried to enter her apartment that night. She remembered his face vividly, she told the Burlington Free Press. Rita's sister Mary Campbell, for one, bought heavily into the Ted Bundy theory. A January 1989 AP article in the Brattleboro Reformer reports that Mary believed serial killer Ted Bundy was responsible for her sister's murder. Quote, his suspected involvement in the Vermont death is discussed in The Stranger Beside Me, a biography of Bundy written by Anne Rule. Burlington police also consider him a suspect. Detective Thomas Tremblay said Tuesday that Bundy's name has been discussed along with others as Curran's killer. He said, quote, that aspect has been actively investigated. We are still investigating. I certainly don't feel totally comfortable eliminating him. Tremblay said he is waiting for information from investigators in Florida who interviewed Bundy this week about a number of unsolved murders. But Burlington Police Chief Kevin Scully was not optimistic that the Florida investigators would come up with new leads on Curran's death. We have looked into the possibility of Ted Bundy's involvement, Scully said. We're satisfied that at the time of Rita Curran's murder, Ted Bundy was somewhere else in the country, end quote. However, Mary Campbell, Rita's sister, noted that, quote, when her picture is put alongside the pictures in the book, she just looks like all the other victims, referring to Rita's reddish-brown hair parted in the middle. Mary wrote Bundy a letter asking if he murdered her sister. Quote, we asked the FBI when they were interrogating him whether if she was one of his cases, and we got back a letter from the FBI that said he did not deny it or acknowledge it, said Campbell. Well, it wasn't a no. In January 1989, knowing that Bundy's execution was imminent, quote, Campbell sent a telegram to Bundy, care of the Florida prison where he lived, giving the name of her sister, the date and place of her death, and asked Bundy if he was involved. I don't really expect to hear anything, but I guess I needed to do it, she said. That all from the Brattleboro Reformer article. And this from the Associated Press in January 1989, quote, 45 minutes before he was electrocuted in Florida for murder, serial killer Ted Bundy specifically denied he murdered anyone in Vermont. Bundy's final confessions came in a 5-minute interview with Florida State Prison Warden Thomas Barton at 6:15 a.m. Tuesday, shortly before he died in the electric chair, end quote. Well, that was a no. Bundy was discounted as a likely suspect and was executed, and Rita's case entered a long, dormant period. In 2010, Detective Thomas Chenette was assigned to review the Rita Curran cold case. He worked to organize the dated materials and assess the availability of forensic evidence. Detective Jeff Beerworth picked up the case in 2013, and the following year he was able finally to significantly advance the case. Beerworth identified a few pieces of physical evidence that he decided to send to the New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for DNA testing. The items included the fingernail scrapings from Rita Curran and vaginal slides collected at her autopsy, and the Lark cigarette butt. I was told that the reason they used the OCME lab was because it had the best forensic lab capabilities at the time, because they had been flooded with resources in the wake of 9/11. The OCME accepted the evidence in Rita's case for analysis. Their report, dated October 29, 2014, stated that they had been able to obtain a male DNA profile from the Lark cigarette butt. This butt was literally 4 decades old, had been tested for prints and saliva, and was crumbling and nasty, but incredibly it yielded a male DNA profile suitable for CODIS. OCME entered the STR profile into the database, but there were no hits. This wasn't all that surprising, as Rita had been killed in 1971, a good 25 years before CODIS was created. It was unlikely that her killer had still been operating in the mid to late 1990s and had his DNA entered into the system. Still, it was a disappointment. A later report from OCME stated that 4 of the 8 vaginal slides from Rita Curran's autopsy had been analyzed, and that there was insufficient amounts of DNA for testing. This was because in the 1990s, the Vermont State Crime Lab had attempted to obtain an STR profile from the semen on the vaginal swabs collected at Rita's autopsy, and had failed. They deemed the DNA to be insufficient to obtain a profile, and used up the evidence in the process. As for the fingernail scrapings, those proved to be unusable. First of all, Rita was a nail biter, so she didn't have much in the way of nails. They were all deteriorated and essentially turned to dust like something out of an Indiana Jones movie. The cigarette butt was going to be their only hope. Brandon Del Pozo was the police chief in Burlington from 2016 to 2020. He talked about the Curran case with the Daily Beast. This sort of thing didn't happen in Burlington, he said. It sent shockwaves for sure. It was the kind of case you never forget. It happened in a community that people felt really safe in, so this gruesome killing was extra shocking. Del Pozo pushed for the Burlington Police Department to continue to work the Curran case despite the CODIS setback because, he told the publication, Curran would have been roughly 72 years old now, so her killer could still be alive, since I doubt he was way older than her. But that does mean that time is running out. We were sending things to labs, interviewing relatives of possible suspects, collecting new DNA. We were making sure we were looking at all avenues. It was an extremely active 46-year-old investigation, end quote. The Burlington Police Department had promised the Curran family that they would have an answer and that cutting-edge DNA testing was being used to try to obtain that answer. So Detective Beerworth started working his way through the suspect list, obtaining DNA samples and trying to eliminate these men once and for all. The suspect list contained the names of 13 men who were considered likely candidates to have killed Rita. These were not people in Rita's life like her hotel manager or ex-boyfriend, who had been eliminated via alibi. These were a cesspool of bad dudes who were in the Burlington area in July 1971 and who were deemed capable of committing the crime. Some of them were deceased, so relatives had to be contacted for buccal swabs. Detective Beerworth doggedly tracked them all down and asked for DNA and palm prints, because the print on Rita's door was still unmatched. Let's talk about some of these guys. One of them was Philip H., who was eliminated by DNA once and for all. He had topped the suspect list for years and years. Another one was a guy named Jay Duffy. This guy would never have gotten on police radar for Rita's case without a tip that came in. Duffy had been alleged to have beaten up his wife in January 1977. But when stories about Rita's case were published for the 20th anniversary of her slaying, Duffy's former wife called in and gave his name as a tip, saying that in 1975 he had confessed to her that he killed Rita. She was able to give details about the murder that matched what had actually happened. Detective Tom Tremblay started investigating Duffy and learned he had been in the state mental hospital in the summer of 1971 and had escaped. He was on the loose, unaccounted for, during the few days, including and surrounding Rita's murder. When police interviewed Duffy, his denials weren't all that convincing. He said his ex-wife was just trying to get back at him for leaving her by tipping his name. But police were intrigued and on his trail. Burlington detectives were very suspicious of Duffy. Detective Beerworth had to obtain a non-testimonial order to obtain DNA from Duffy in Florida. Another guy they looked at was a T. Audette. Police had long considered 24-year-old repeat offender T. Audette as a possible suspect in Rita's case. Audette had been arrested for aiding and abetting a fugitive, a burglar named Dayton Cameron, who escaped from Vermont State Prison. Then in December 1970, Audette was arrested for breaking into the office of Dr. Robert O'Brien to steal drugs, and he made off with a serious haul. In the break-in on May 12, 1970, he stole 3,500 phenobarbital tablets, 2,000 dextroamphetamines, and 5,000 belladonnas. Audette, a carpet layer from South Burlington, lived 3 miles from Rita and had a history of psychiatric problems. He was arrested after an investigation into the prison escape spearheaded by Detective Winterbottom and VSP investigator Leo Blaise, and prosecuted by Patrick Leahy, all of whom were intimately familiar with Rita's case, which is how Audette's name got on their radar. Another guy named Paul St. Laurent had been arrested when he was about 18 for child abuse. This was several months after Rita's murder. From jail, he called the victim's parents and asked them to drop the charges because, quote, he did something in Burlington last summer that no one knew about, end quote. St. Laurent was killed in a car crash in August 1972 at age 20. He and his co-worker were driving a van owned by their employer, a janitorial service at the time. Detective Beerworth had to obtain DNA from a direct relative to test against the DNA and evidence in Rita's case. 33-year-old Paul Hale was a bookkeeper arrested in June 1972 for a May 10th rape. A 22-year-old female teacher was hitchhiking on Pearl Street after her car broke down. Hale and his buddy Gary Francis picked her up and raped her in their truck. Hale was arrested and sent to the Vermont State Hospital for evaluation to see if he was competent to stand trial. He was, and 2 more counts of rape were added for a separate incident on May 24th. In this one, according to the Burlington Free Press, which accessed the criminal complaint, Hale and a male accomplice walked into a Westford residence at midnight and threatened a young female with a sawed-off shotgun. They raped her, and a short time later, another young woman came home to the same house, and she, too, was held at gunpoint and raped by both men. This is a quote from the article. The defense counsel said Hale's escapades resulted from use of alcohol and pressures due to tax problems. Hale got 10 to 15 years for all 3 counts. He was the subject of a tip called in on Rita's case in 1991. He had been living in a Burlington apartment at the time of her slaying, and when detectives tracked down his roommate, he recounted an incident around the time of Rita's murder, when Hale came home at 2 o'clock in the morning, all bloody, and burned his clothes in a wood stove. If I'm the cops hearing that, I'm all in on Hale. DNA was collected for him as well. An S. Paquette of Milton, a telephone company employee, was arrested in June 1975 at age 34 for kidnapping and raping an 18-year-old woman named Patricia. She reported that he picked her up hitchhiking, beat her with a glass bottle, raped her, and left her wearing only a torn T-shirt at an industrial gravel pit in Richmond. He was also suspected in a similar incident that took place on June 10th. He was acquitted after a trial when the survivor's details did not match up to the jury's satisfaction, but he stayed on the investigators' list. And an R. McKinstry, a 20-year-old laborer, was arrested on charges of lewd behavior in the presence of a child for an incident in the spring of 1967. Then he was arrested again in 1968 for exposure to a UVM co-ed on South Prospect Street. 27-year-old Sarah Carr was walking on the UVM campus on her way home when a man came around the building and walked toward her, his sex organs exposed, and he tried to grab her. She whacked him with a motorcycle helmet she was carrying, and he ran off. She picked him out of a police mugshot book the next day, and McKinstry was arrested and charged with gross lewdness. At his trial, his relatives all testified that he was at a family gathering at the time of the event, and he was acquitted. So all of these guys, a total of 12 creeps, were eliminated via direct DNA comparisons, some of which were from court-mandated samples, and others by kinship testing of surviving direct relatives, quote, which involved testing by DNA Labs International using the DNA extract used by the NYC OCME in 2014, which was frozen in evidence, end quote. And then there was Ted Bundy. Bundy was, of course, long dead and had been discounted as a viable suspect by some previous investigators, such as former police chief Kevin Scully. But modern investigators refused to rule him out for Rita's murder absent a DNA elimination. Detective Tom Chanette, who rejoined the Detective Bureau and the case in 2016, said, quote, as far as the Bundy connection, he was born in Burlington, the manner of death would fit his later M.O., and there is some controversy as to his whereabouts in 1971. He is on the suspect list. However, no direct connection has ever been made, end quote. Chanette acknowledged that police believed Bundy to have been active in 1971, meaning that he was killing victims that early on. But again, it was really unclear where exactly Bundy was in July of that year. Bundy's DNA was entered into CODIS posthumously, and comparisons of Bundy's STR profile to the DNA from the cigarette butt proved not to be a match. But police didn't entirely cross him off their list, on the off chance that the cigarette butt hadn't been left by the killer, and Bundy was the man who attacked and raped Rita after all. Bundy was the one guy they didn't feel comfortable eliminating, just because he was such a prolific, successful serial killer, and basically, you never knew with him. Okay, you guys, I know everyone's excited for this moment. Those of you who entered the 5-star review raffle contest, thank you so much. We received quite a few submissions. The rules were that you had to submit a 5-star review on the podcast platform of your choice and send us a screenshot with your name and address, and you would be entered into a raffle to receive some DNA ID swag. I've got all the names here in a jar, and I'm going to reach in. I'm going to pick out 3 names, and those lucky winners will receive a box from me. And thank you again to everyone who participated. 5-star reviews really help the show grow. Okay, the first name is Trish Connors. Congratulations. Second name is Rachel Wheeler. Congratulations. And the last name is Astrid Murga. Congratulations. Look out for a box from DNA ID coming your way. Thank you so much to everyone who participated. This is the end of part 1 of the Rita Curran case. Part 2 is available right now.